convinced my 7-year-old daughter is mentally insane. My daughter has been having extremely disturbing visions. Either she's turned insane or she's trying to warn me about something. I'm a rational person. I don't believe in the supernatural. But I honestly can't find a logical explanation for what's been happening lately. 4 months ago, my partner and I separated. Sarah, our only child, is 7 years old and she was hit hard by the breakup. I have full custody, but he has her every other weekend. I have stressed multiple times that he is not to let his personal relationship with his girlfriend impact our daughter, but I'm no longer sure he listened. After the divorce, we moved into a new house outside of New York. This was where everything started going wrong. When we moved in, we decided to redecorate her room. When you walk into her room, it looks like you've wandered into a snowy forest, and she loved it. Little did I know that this would be the reason for my worst nightmares. On the Sunday night before Sarah was due to start school, she was playing alone in her room, and I decided to check on her. Her bedroom door was open, just a crack, and I could hear her inside talking to someone. She was making regular pauses as if the other person was responding, but I couldn't hear anyone else in the room. It wasn't like normal playtime where she gives each of her toys a specific character and a different voice. She was just candidly talking to some invisible entity, and apparently they were replying. I decided not to interfere in her little game as I didn't want to embarrass her. She's a very sweet, shy, and mild-mannered child, but I'd never seen her do this before. At 8 p.m., her bedtime, I went up again and there was no sound at all. I gently knocked on the door and found her already in her pajamas reading a book in bed. She's always been very well behaved. I sat on the edge of the bed with her and we read a short story together. It is a ritual we've always had and I know it helps her sleep. That night, for whatever reason, she desperately wanted to read a book called Gorilla. It's a bit childish for a 7-year-old, but I indulged. And we had a good laugh over the image of the gorilla dressed as Superman. This is where it starts to get troubling. Just before I was about to kiss her goodnight, Sarah asked me, "Do you think the gorilla in the story is real?" "Of course not, sweetie, but with your imagination, he can be," I replied. "Is the old lady imaginary too?" she asked me. I was staggered. I pulled back and looked her in the face. "What old lady?" "The one who lives in the walls," she said. "I talk to her sometimes. She's really friendly, but when she sings, it hurts my ears." At first I felt alarmed, but I calmly reminded myself that it wasn't unusual for children to have imaginary friends, particularly when they're feeling lonely or isolated, which she probably felt from the divorce. "Was that who you were talking to earlier?" She nodded enthusiastically, beaming up at me with her adorably crooked grin, full of gaps where the tooth fairy had reaped her share of baby teeth. "Well, I've never heard of an old lady living in the walls before," I said. "But if she starts singing again and it bothers you, come let me know and I'll have a word with her." With that, I kissed her goodnight, closed the door, and prepared her backpack for the following school day before heading to bed myself. Over the next week, Sarah became a lot happier as she made new friends at school. This filled my heart with joy. From the sounds of things, she was fitting in perfectly. However, this is when things started to take a dark turn. She was supposed to be going to stay with her father that weekend, but on Thursday night, I received a message from him saying he wouldn't be able to have her over. When I told Sarah the news, she was utterly crestfallen and I felt helpless. On the Saturday, I made an effort to take her out for a tour of the town. In the town center, there's a small museum that has a variety of taxidermied animals, including a huge brown bear. It was absolutely adorable seeing her there. That night, as we finished our bedtime story and I tucked her in, it seems that seeing all of those stuffed animals had had an effect because she asked me if we could get a pet dog. It was my ex-husband who had always been against the idea, since we had lived in a city and simply didn't have the space, but he wasn't around anymore. I told her I'd think about, but secretly I had already made my decision. Later on, as I was dropping off to sleep, I became aware of a faint scrabbling noise outside of my door. At first I thought it might be my tired mind playing tricks on me, but then it became louder and more distinct. It was the scratch of claws against the wood, the delicate tapping of small paws on the floor. It sounded like some small creature was literally rushing around the house. I thought it might be a rat, so I got up to investigate. As I opened the door, I realized the sound was coming directly from Sarah's room. "Sarah," I called out. No response. In a panic, I rushed to her bedroom and threw open the door. When I switched the light on, the sound immediately ceased. Sarah was just stood at the center of her room, stock still, staring at the wall. "Sarah, what are you doing?" I asked. "The old lady," Sarah replied. "She was running around the room. I was watching her. I think she's trapped in the walls." I hugged her gently and led her back to bed. "There's no old lady in the walls, sweetheart," I told her, stroking her soft brown hair. "It was probably just a rat that you heard. I'll have a look tomorrow and see what's going on." As I went back to my room, it suddenly dawned on me what might be happening. The old lady episodes appeared to coincide with whenever Sarah felt neglected by her father. Perhaps the two were connected. Maybe the trapped old lady was her way of expressing how much she missed her father. The whole episode had been very alarming, but the more I thought about it, the more sense it made. That is, until last night. To put it into context, it had been over a week since the running old lady incident, and I had nearly forgotten about the whole thing, to be honest. Yesterday evening, I was enjoying a glass of wine while reading a book in our living room, and Sarah was playing upstairs by herself. At around 7 p.m., I heard loud shuffling noises coming from Sarah's room, followed by what I now know was the sound of soft crying. Feeling concerned, I put down my book and went to climb the stairs. That's when the screaming started. I have never heard Sarah scream like that in her entire life, not even when she was a baby. It was a blood-curdling, heart-piercing, eye-watering sort of scream, the kind of noise you expect to hear from an animal in its death throes. I ran upstairs and burst into her room as fast as I could. There she was, standing in the center of the room, arms limp by her side, weeping uncontrollably and screaming. "She won't stop!" she called out to me. "She won't stop singing!" All I could hear were Sarah's plaintive cries. Who? Who won't stop singing?" Sarah frantically pointed to the walls, then cupped both her ears in her hands. I walked over to her slowly and rested my hands over hers. She had stopped screaming by this point, but she was still visibly upset. "It's okay, sweetheart," I whispered. "Everything is okay." She looked up at me with tearful eyes and allowed me to gently pull her hands away from her ears. It was only then that I finally noticed the blood trickling from her right ear. The horror I felt in that moment is indescribable. I immediately drove her to the nearest hospital, and since she's a minor, we managed to be seen relatively quickly. After checking her ear thoroughly, the doctor told me that she had a perforated eardrum, and the damage was quite profound. Since she hadn't had any form of ear infection, the doctor surmised that the damage was caused by forcibly shoving some object, such as an earbud, into her ear far enough that it pierced the eardrum. I told him I had done no such thing, and I didn't believe Sarah would ever do something so foolish to herself, but evidently he didn't believe me. He then asked to speak with my daughter privately, but I was forced to leave the room. As we drove home, I asked Sarah what the doctor had talked to her about, and she told me he'd asked if I'd done this to her. It seems they were worried it might be a case of child abuse. I know that I would never lay a finger on her, so I'm not worried about any accusations on that front. A week later, we returned back to the hospital for a checkup. A specialist confirmed that she fortunately wouldn't need to have surgery on her ear, as it had already started healing quite promisingly. So, I promised Sarah that she was in for a treat on Friday. I thought this would be where the nightmare ends. Sarah had told me she wanted a puppy, so I decided to reserve a dog from a dog shelter. We drove to the shelter on Friday, and I told Sarah that she could pick any dog she wanted. She was instantly enticed to a poor little one-eyed spaniel, and it was love at first sight. I'd set aside the whole weekend for us to spend training the puppy, taking him for walks, teaching Sarah how to bathe him, and figuring out what kind of food he liked. From the first moment, the two of them seemed to be thick as thieves. So, when Sarah asked if Pepper could sleep in her room, I naturally agreed. This was the worst mistake I had ever made. On the Saturday night, I heard something that made my heart sink. As I passed by Sarah's room, I could hear her singing some sort of nursery rhyme. I thought she might be trying to sing Pepper to sleep, and imagining how adorable that must look, I couldn't help but spy on them. Sarah was so engrossed in her singing that I managed to open the door without her noticing. With the door open, I could clearly hear what she was saying. It was unlike any nursery rhyme I've ever heard before, but the lyrics sent chills down my spine. The little old lady, she lives in the walls, and she crawls, and she crawls, and she crawls. The little old lady, she's trapped in the walls, and she crawls, and she crawls, and she crawls. She just kept singing these two lines over and over again. Pepper was sat next to her and appeared to be calmly watching her, mesmerized by her song. I slowly entered her room and asked her what she was doing. "I was just singing to Pepper," she told me. "Where did you hear that song?" I asked her. She paused for a moment. "I learned it in school." As far as I knew, Sarah had never lied to me before. But this was outright untrue. Why would her school be teaching nursery rhymes to 7-year-old children? Not to mention how disturbing the rhyme was in the first place. "Now, Sarah, please tell me the truth." She was sat on the floor, so I sat down cross-legged opposite her. "I won't be angry at you. Who really taught you this song?" "It was the old lady," Sarah said with an air of reluctance that made me regret asking. "You need to stop singing that song, okay, Sarah? Promise Mummy you'll never sing that song again?" I ran my fingers through her hair gently. "The old lady is not your friend, and you need to forget about her." "I promise," she said, bowing her head slightly from guilt. "I'm sorry I lied, Mummy. It's okay." I lifted her chin up and smiled at her. "Now let's get you to bed so we can read a bedtime story." I wished I could simply forget what happened that night, but I needed answers, and I needed them now. After I picked Sarah up from school the next day, it was wonderful to see a bunch of girls saying goodbye to her. She'd clearly made friends here. She told me that her friend Lucy was having a small birthday party tonight, and she had been invited. I spoke to Lucy's mother in the parking lot of the school, and she said it was just going to be a small slumber party of about 5 girls, but that she'd drive them all to school the following day. All I needed to do was drop Sarah off at Lucy's house with a backpack of fresh clothes and a packed lunch. I hoped that everything would be fine. Maybe it was just because of Sarah's room that she was having these insane episodes. In spite of my concerns about Sarah's ear, I was overjoyed that she had been invited to her first birthday party so soon after starting a new school, and decided it would be better if she went. We returned to the house, packed Sarah's bag, and headed to Lucy's house. When I arrived back at the house, I heard our puppy Pepper barking upstairs. I thought perhaps that he had spotted the rat that I was convinced was running around the place, so I went up to investigate. What I found was so much worse. He was inside Sarah's room, but the lights were all switched off. I turned them on, and there he was, stood in the middle of the room, fiercely barking at the wall. His little hackles were up, and he looked very cute. At first I laughed, until I saw what he was barking at. In the patterns of the wallpaper, I could see the figure of an elderly woman hunched in the darkened corner of the room. I don't know exactly how to explain it, but it appeared as though the snowflake motif on the wallpaper had taken the shape of an old woman. I rubbed my eyes and thought perhaps I might be seeing things. Then she started running. I could see the shape of her, bent double, hobbling around the room so fast that my eyes could barely keep up with her. Pepper's barking became more frantic, and he backed away from the wall in fear, nestling himself between my legs and trembling. Without really processing exactly what was happening, I scooped my dog up in one hand, shut the light off with the other, and ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me. Is it possible I'm just imagining things? Please help. I'm stuck in the house and I don't want to go upstairs if that thing is still there.